Excellent. Hello and welcome everyone to PNP Live. My name is Bashan. I'm part of the event staff of Politics and Prose. Before we do get started this event, just want to go over a couple quick items. First is that at any time during this event, if you'd like to ask a question of either one of our authors, we would ask for you to place it into the Q&A box, which you can find towards the bottom of your webinar screen. Additionally, at any point during this event, you'll be able to go to the chat section where you can find a link which will take you directly to Politics and Prose website, where you'll be able to purchase a copy of The Burning God and also a copy of Rebel Sisters, which also just came out November 17th. Our featured author today is Rebecca Kuang. Rebecca studies modern Chinese history. She has a bachelor's arts degree from Georgetown University and is currently a graduate student at Oxford University on a Marshall Scholarship. She is joined in conversation by Tochi Onyebuchi. Tochi holds a bachelor's from Yale, an MFA in screenwriting from Tisch, a master's degree in global economic law from Sciences Po, and a JD from Columbia Law School. His writing has appeared in Asimov's and Ideomancer, among other places. Tochi is the author of Rebel Sisters, as previously mentioned, Beasts Made of Night, and Crown of Thunder. Without any further ado, Rebecca and Tochi.
Insert audience cheering noise here.
Oh my God, we've both been to too many years of school, which is something that we have to talk about.
It's so funny because I remember when the Poppy War came out and reading your bio, like on the back flap, I had this titanic sense of relief, like, okay, it's not just me. Like, it's like, we're just like, to be in the company of another, like intensely like school, acclimated person. It's very comforting. It's very, very, very comforting. So I am very happy and honored to be talking. Like, so I'm just going to jump right into it. We were talking off. It sounds weird to say offline because it was still online, but it wasn't, it was
sort of back channeling.
We were back channeling about Sylvia Wynter, who we both happen to have on the brain recently. And it's funny. So I'd been rereading some of her work and some of her background and everything. And what I found really interesting was this idea of I think it's interesting. I see some of what she's talking about sort of embodied in the Toni Morrison project of sort of moving the center. And so the idea of who you write about as being the sort of center of your universe. She gets, Morrison gets asked, why she doesn't write white people. And she's like, that's not the center of my universe. And so reading the Poppy War, the Dragon Republic, and now the Burning God, it seems not like, and it's not just that the story is, Chinese analog characters entirely, but also that the inspiration that you're drawing from, the Easter eggs, all the the mythological references, the historical event, all of that is from this very specific well of inspiration. So could you, talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, I hadn't heard of the phrase moving the center before, but I definitely want to unpack that in a second. But I think we should backtrack and explain how we got on the topic of Wynter in the first place, which was we were wondering what our relationship is to storytelling, especially during times of crises and during a pandemic when so much is going on outside. I remember at one point during the election, I was trying to write because it's NaNoWriMo and I'm trying to hit my word count every day. And I just kept watching beautiful Steve Kornacki on MSNBC and thinking none of what I do matters, right? I literally, if we lose this election, it doesn't matter. This dark academia novel, doesn't matter. No one's gonna read it. I don't care. I don't care about this project. I don't see what good it does to the world when really I should be out on the streets, canvassing, volunteering, etc. All these things that are incredibly dangerous to do in Florida at this time, which is why I'm not doing them. And just feeling a sense of disillusionment and guilt at the, I think, indulgence of being a storyteller and making your living off of writing. So we get to Wynter because Wynter's big on storytelling. And one of the arguments she makes is that oh man, how do we go from man 1 to man 2 to storytelling?
Yeah.
Okay. So she says our current regime of knowledge is based on, so it used to be theocentric, at least in the West. The church dictated everything. We understood ourselves and other people by who was saved by God and who wasn't, who was spiritual, who was the fallen flesh. Then when Copernicus disproved like the universe, I guess, we moved to a system of man 2, which is biocentric. So we judge ourselves against other people by thinking who is selected by evolution or deselected, right? Like that's where like racist, like Darwinist ideas come in. And she argues that a great mistake of the 21st century and how we see ourselves still and how we see people that we consider lesser, right? Like irrational, not as evolved, not as civilized, is that we're so wedded to this biocentric idea of what a person is, what a human is. And then she says we have to understand that humans are not just bios, they're also mythoi. And I haven't taken a class in winter, so I could be pronouncing this wrong. But basically, mythoi is our masks and our origin stories and how we come to understand ourselves. And our claim is that we are storytellers who have story told ourselves into thinking we're purely biological. But if we are ever going to move past that, then we need new stories and we need a regime of knowledge that isn't just so science-centric, just so evolution, biology, like, supposedly objective markers of who's human, who's not, but a blend of the two, which I interpret as a mix of humanities and STEM and a call for, these two cultures to talk to each other. So we get from there to choosing who we write about, right? Because the great question is who counts as human, who counts as man, how do we conceive of ourselves compared to other people, how do we construct our enemies, etc. So when I'm writing the Poppy War and the Dragon Republic, it's not just that it's a narrative from a Chinese point of view, or more precisely a Chinese diaspora point of view, which gets tricky because there's also like internalized whiteness, and which I still don't really know what to deal with, but being able to identify it is better than not being able to identify it. But there's also an ongoing narrative about how we construct enemies and cycles of dehumanization, how it becomes possible to kill someone when you've convinced yourself that they're not even a person, that they're just a cockroach, that they're just an insect, that they can just be stepped on and nothing will have been lost from the world. Yeah, and I try to present these debates a lot where characters will argue that because one side did something so atrocious, they no longer have any moral value. There's no reason to let them stay alive, no reason for forgiveness or reparations or any sort of meaningful peace process forward. And at the end of The Burning God, the characters have not achieved this reconciliation, and I still don't really know what it looks like because we don't have great historical examples of what that looks like. We still don't know how China would have moved on from the traumas of World War II if it ever properly moved on, instead of just politicizing all this trauma for nationalist gain. So I feel like I just changed the topic 12 times there, but
Oh, I love it. No, but
your opening question.
There's so much there. Like also too, to the, to what you had like just brought up about, the sort of national traumas and how countries move on from them or in many ways don't move on from them. I kept trying to think of examples that didn't necessarily involve the imposition of domestic dynamics by, external powers. And so, oftentimes you'll find that things like truth and reconciliation commissions or other sort of, postmortems or other attempts to repair will be imposed by either, some internationalized organization like, the World Bank or the UN or what have you, or there'll be like another occupying power, like, I don't know, like the US or something like that, who's like, okay, this is how this is going to go. This is who's going to be put in charge afterwards, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was interesting seeing something of that sort embodied in the Hesperians and seeing the different ways in which, sort of colonial powers can inject themselves into conversation. Like it's something that I think about so much with the Biafran War, with the Nigerian Civil War, because it was almost immediately internationalized. And of course, like, you have to deal with you have to address the fact that so much of the situation that birthed it was colonialism, right? Like the British were like, okay, when we leave, these are the people that are going to stay in power, and this is how it's going to be set up, et cetera, et cetera. But like, when you have this sort of national trauma, and I guess, so now I'm the one who's jumping around doing the 12 different topics, but like, I think it's like, one of the things that Rebel Sisters deals with a lot is the issue of memory with relation to trauma. So both on a personal, but also on a sort of political level. And particularly with the Burning God, I see it's almost like on the opposite pole, where you're dealing with myth making in the midst of national trauma. And so it's interesting to see those two things sort of in conversation. And I was like, so to bring it all sort of back to myth and to storytelling and whatnot, one of the interesting things that I think the Burning God does in terms of topics that it gets into is this, it's almost like you're watching myth making in real time as the war's happening. Like, I feel like there have been so many depictions where the myth has been created after the conflict has ended as this sort of negotiated piece, the idea of, the lost cause after the American Civil War, and, the idea that this conflict over chattel slavery was really just a disagreement between, equal parties or what have you. But in the Burning God, like literally as these battles are fighting, or even as the smoke is still rising from the battlefield, you can see soldiers engaging in puppetry, like, depicting the thing that happened and so I thought that was really fascinating. So could you talk a little bit about like the sort of myth making in the midst of national trauma?
Yes, I'm taking notes on topics to cover though, because you like hit on things like 2 minutes ago that I want to respond to first. So first, the Western meddling in civil wars and the unseen ripple effects from that meddling is something that I've talked to Ken Liu about a lot, and he has this great frustration with the way that we blame China for the path that it's taken without understanding how much of that is a colonialist inference. Wow, I'm blanking on the word. Interference. Yeah. So and on the topic of reconciliation and peace, right? Like what people don't know is that, so we think that the rape of Nanjing is this event that went largely unrecognized by the West, that nobody knew about or talked about until 60 years later, when Iris Chung published her book, The Rape of Nanjing. But what a lot of people don't know is that there were actually like war tribunals that took place shortly after the Japanese surrendered. Like those generals were put on trial. They were sentenced, and like testimony was given, like evidence was read. But the reason why these didn't really result in any sort of meaningful justice is because no side really had the incentive to punish the Japanese very severely. The reason why is because the nationalists were allied with the Americans, and the nationalists later like needed American support to defeat the communists, and they didn't get enough, which means they lost the Chinese Civil War. And there was a whole debate over like, did America lose China? Like, is America's like failure to intervene enough the cause of the monster that the PRC has become today? And dude, I don't know.
That is an existential question.
But the point being, right, like Japan was also an American ally, so the nationalists don't want to piss off Japan too much, and that's why the trials didn't go anywhere. Which all goes to say, right, there is this human loss, this human suffering that was not recognized at the time, and still has not been recognized, because the ways of commemorating it that we have today are, they suit the party, they suit an anti-Japanese nationalist agenda, but they are not propagated in the interest of true justice to the victims. All right, moving on to the question of myth making. Yeah, so I think, so it wasn't until I started taking history courses in storytelling and historiography and history and story, and how really those are the same thing, that I came to understand how fluid the tales that we tell about ourselves and how we understand ourselves are. And something that I really love is how there's so many different versions of very common myths. And just one example is the myth of the moon goddess Chang'e, right? So in the classic myth, the myth that most little Chinese kids learn from their parents. Her husband, the archer, shoots down 9 suns. There are 10 suns in the sky. That's a whole other story. The gods reward him with a peach that will grant immortal life if you share it with somebody else. And Chang'e gets greedy, and when he's out, she eats the whole peach by herself because I guess she doesn't understand the rules or something. And she becomes so celestial and unable to be tethered to the earth that she flies away and lands on the moon. And that's her punishment for being too greedy and wanting too much and going behind the back of her husband. But there's also another version that's not quite as popular, and it's pretty obvious why, which is that she did it on purpose and she knew exactly what she was doing, and she wanted to be on the moon. She wanted eternal life. She did not want to be human, and she stole that peach. And if you're telling that version of the story, then that's a story that's like girl power, liberation, right? Like feminine choice, etc. So something that I tried to depict in the Poppy War trilogy was no one's really quite sure who the trifecta were or what happened to them, and no one's really quite sure what happened on Sphere, and no one is really quite sure like what happened when the goddess Nuwa created humanity. But they all tell these different versions of it because it serves their understanding of themselves and the way that they justify their own power. Then on the question of myth making in action in the present. So this was something that the communists were really good at. They really understood. I mean, well, so I think the communists today are better at being authoritarians than anybody ever has been because they really understand the purpose of story and image. But but this isn't a new development. Like Mao was very good at it. He was good at self-romanticizing, at projecting an image of himself. So while they were going through these trials, such as the Long March, right, like which really was a communist defeat. Like they just walked for a long time, and a lot of them died, and it was a retreat, and it was not anything heroic or brave, but at the end of it, right, the communists were like, this is the founding story of our movement. Like this, look at what we went through to get to this space to establish ourselves as the right, like the true regime of China, right? Like that is such a romantic, and they had an artist corps. They had writers who'd listened to Mao's talk at Yan'an in the 1940s, where he said the purpose of storytelling is to foster political means. Storytelling is political. This is the kind of story that you have to write. This is the kind of narrative that you have to support. And they did that, and they wrote those stories, and they really romanticized the communists, like often weeks after they did anything. So Rin is becoming aware of this too. When Daji tells her, right, like you need to project an image of yourself that you're not, so that people follow you. And the effect, I guess this isn't that spoilery. The effect of this is that she gets a crowd full of people to literally rip two people apart on the strength of her charisma and the symbol or the ideas that she symbolizes. And yeah, that's so powerful. And it's not something that we construct like hundreds of years later or even decades later. I think it's really important to understand that like myth making happens around us, like, and people are conscious of it, and people who can wield that power effectively and deliberately are really scary.
Yeah, no, and so like that was a wild scene. But also too, there's I really appreciated the examples of sort of the politicization of storytelling that you brought up, which, you know, oftentimes to me almost seems like a redundancy, because I think, you know, and I think this is some of what you were alluding to earlier as well, is it feels like storytelling is inherently political. Like every story has an agenda, even if it's in the like leaving out of certain details, or if it's in the inclusion of certain details, who the protagonist is, like why they made the choices that they made. It seems like every story is political. And this, it reminds me of like, especially, you know, hearing Ken talk about Chinese science fiction and reading some of the essays in Invisible Planets and Broken Stars, how the authors will sometimes talk about how Chinese science fiction, you know, was geared towards emphasizing, there was a sort of hard bent to it that was geared towards emphasizing technological advances as a way to sort of almost propagandize, you know, the PRC's technological like achievements and things of that sort. So it was almost like, you know, in certain ways analogous to like the Uncle Sam, like "We want you" posters and stuff like that. And so it's like, I think, so I guess bringing it back to us, what do you think is the sort of political or politicized dimension of the type of storytelling that we engage in as speculative fiction writers?
Dude, I don't know. So there's the project that I think I'm doing, which is presenting a side of humanity, looking from the perspectives of those whose stories haven't been told, in order to foster empathy, like encourage people to think outside their shoes, live lives they haven't led, whatever. But so the reason why I'm increasingly skeptical of this project, and why I'm asking everybody I come across for their thoughts, because I'm really searching for answers, is I don't know how effective that is if you're already only talking to people who agree. And so an analogy that is relevant in my academic work that I also haven't found the workaround to was we always study Chinese literature, and so I focus on modern contemporary Chinese literature. And during the socialist era, a lot of this is heavily ideological. It's a lot of propaganda. It's literature with the purpose of changing other people's minds, to mobilize a country, to get people to care about national self-defense or the communist movement or whatever. And it's always studied from the perspective of the creator and what they're trying to accomplish. And I think those goals are very transparent. But what we don't have is good research on, and what is in some way like impossible to figure out, is the impact on audience, like who is actually reading it, whose mind was actually changed, right? And what I suspect, and what we think we know from like the scant evidence we have, is that the people who were reading those stories were already urban elites. They were already well educated. Like, the people writing about peasants weren't writing to the peasants. They were writing to the people in the cities who were already probably on their same side. So we have this whole field of literature that we think like did so much work in national myth making, but we don't have a way of measuring impact. So I mean, and that's the question I have now about the Poppy War trilogy, because the people who picked it up are the people who were, likely going to care about Asia anyways, who are going to care about what happened to China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. And even if they didn't learn all of that, even if like they wouldn't have learned that if they hadn't read the Poppy War, like they would have been open to that information if they received it in any other context. So it's like, and I think impact as a storyteller is also impossible to measure, because even if you are like subtly changing people's minds, like that doesn't translate into action, doesn't translate into like real cultural shifts until years later. I think Uncle Tom's Cabin was probably a unique storytelling moment that I think is like praised for more impact than it was, because it's not like white people freed the slaves freed the slaves by fighting for their slavery, and making like slavery untenable as an economic system. But so I don't know, and the answers that I used to toss around that I thought were satisfying, like it's important to represent yourself, it's important for people to see themselves and people who aren't like them and learn about them, like they feel frivolous to me now, even though I like objectively they're probably true. It's just that in this moment I'm having a really hard time seeing it.
Yeah, no, it's that's definitely a space that I'm living in now, especially because Beast Made of Night, my debut, came out in 2017, and especially in the world of kidlit, there's so much emphasis put on books as empathy machines, or like that being the sort of primary mode of their existence. It's about exposing, they won't say, but exposing majority white readers to non-white characters, protagonists who are different from them, etc. And at first, I really, really, really latched on to that idea of books as empathy machines. In a lot of the ways that you're describing, the sort of self-removal that reading as an act, demands. The idea that you have to step into another person's shoes, another character's shoes, etc. But then, like, the more that I thought about it, I was like, wait, if this is how books are supposed to work, or this is how they're sort of designed to work, then why is there still anti-Black racism? Like, Toni Morrison's books have been around for decades now. If this is how books are supposed to work, she would have cured racism. Baldwin would have cured racism, by having told, white Americans about themselves, right? But I think one of the interesting things, there's so much talk about preaching to the choir. And I think one of the things that we saw with this past presidential election was, the value of revving up your own congregation. And so when we talk about storytelling, this is something that, the American right is really, really, really good at, the imagery of, for instance, the welfare queen, think like very visceral, speaks to the heart before it gets to the mind type of imagery, where you can get somebody frothing at the mouth over something like the earned income, like tax credit, because
Did you
in
read
their
N.K. Jemisin's thread about this recently? I think it was like very
yes,
shortly after the election.
exactly, and so like that's exactly is storytelling. Storytelling is messaging, right? In many ways, and it's I think one of the things that at least the American political media apparatus is running up against is the idea of audience and who you believe your audience is versus who your audience actually is. And so often, almost every sort of election cycle, people talk about voter apathy, but they don't talk about voter apathy with regards to the Republican Party. They talk about voter apathy with regards to the Democratic Party, right? Like getting Democrat. It's like you don't have to tell conservative Americans like why it's important for them to vote. And the ways in which their immediate circumstances might be changed by their having cast this vote. But it seems as though it's a constant sort of struggle with the American left. And I think so much of that comes down to storytelling and the lack of, I guess, urgency given to the project of speaking to one's congregation. And so it's interesting thinking of sort of recasting the idea of books as empathy machines in that regard, because then it becomes not so much about changing another person's mind so much as it is about reaffirming somebody who didn't necessarily feel affirmed to begin with. Like that's one of the things that I wonder about with the Poppy War, with the Dragon Republic, with the Burning God is readers who some of this comes down to representation. Readers who didn't see themselves or people who look like them, dark-skinned Southern, protagonist from, an analog of Southern China, like as a hero, right? And here they are presented with that, that in and of it's like, that's a good thing. Is it also a social utility, right? And is it even, right to think of committing that sort of act as a social utility?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the purpose of storytelling so much as being focused on revving up your own congregation, speaking to people who look like you and reaffirming them, which I guess I should have thought more about.
No, it took me a while to get there.
My mind is right, like, how do you convert the other side? But maybe you can't convert the other side. You just have to win. But I think, so one problem I keep coming back to is whether our dedication to nuance and complexity is hurting our ability to effectively message. And N.K. Jemisin talked about this in her thread, where her thesis was that what happened during the election was a failure of storytelling on the left, where we don't have like pithy, short, like cool, quippy myths to tell people. We're like, no, like look at the numbers. Like if you understand these policies, like here is how like erasing student debt is going to be better for everybody in the long run. When the right can just be
nice little Freudian slip there. Yeah.
When the right can just be like, we paid off our student loans, like why aren't they paying off their student loans? And like sometimes like it is messy and there isn't an easy heuristic for understanding that. And like in every other academic field, right, like one of the first things you learn as a graduate student is like those easy, simple, like convenient narratives like are not good for you. You have to resist the urge to storytell and create a narrative in your research. You have to try to look at it from as objective perspective as possible and tease out even the arguments that don't fit your myth. And so the way this relates to the way that the Poppy War is received, and I guess like Chinese diaspora identity, is I I think there are a couple levels of becoming comfortable with yourself as an Asian American and specifically a Chinese American. And the first level, which is very unnuanced, is recognizing that for a lot of your life, you've been trying to assimilate into white society. You haven't really wanted to connect with your Chinese culture and your roots, which is where I was at. And then, suddenly there's a day, maybe you join like the Chinese Students Association in college or whatever, where you're like, suddenly I love everything Asian. I drink boba tea, like I watch these K-pop or these K-dramas. I love these K-pop bands. I love these C-pop bands. Like I'm taking classes and learning Chinese. I'm so proud of my Chinese heritage and I'm so proud of China. But the difficult thing there, right, is that then they end up in a really tricky place where they don't know what to do with the fact that there is a lot to criticize about the PRC, just as there is a lot to criticize about the US. And I see a lot of Chinese Americans getting so defensive, right, whenever their classmates are like, okay, but like concentration camps, like, okay, but like no freedom of speech, like journalists being beaten up and detained. And they're like, how dare you come after my home country? So the popular tries to pick apart a lot of what we mythologize about China, what we think is beautiful and wonderful about China. Like this ancient imperial exam, which is held up as like the gold standard of meritocracy and giving everybody an equal education or equal chance at education and moving up. And you could be like a poor peasant and turn into like a high-ranking government official, but that's not how it actually worked, right? Like just as the SAT works in the US, like if you have money, if you have the leisure time to read and study, if you have people to pay for tutors, right? Like if you can devote your entire childhood to studying for the exam instead of working the fields, you're more likely to become a scholar, especially if you're like the son of a scholar. And where was I going with this? The point being, and like communist mythology, right? And just so many critiques of the PRC. And so there's another level of like this more nuanced reflection of, okay, I'm Chinese American and I bear heritage to two countries that whose cultures have achieved wonderful, beautiful things and, have also done like very horrific things. And I don't really know what to do with that. I don't like, it's not like I have to constantly apologize for who I am, but, like being Han Chinese means you're the dominant majority in China. It means you're the regional hegemon, right? Like it's possible to be marginalized in the US, but not marginalized in China. And like, what do you do with that? And that's not an easy story. That's not an easy sell. You can't explain all of those complexities in like a paragraph, which is why I don't know what that means for our ability to effectively message when people have very short attention spans and aren't like scrolling to the end of the Atlantic article in their Atlantic app when they're pooping. So, I don't know. Like I've read like the first 5 paragraphs of so many Atlantic articles, and then I should move on with my day.
Yeah, no, it's like my sort of, it's funny, everybody's sort of watching the Crown now with the newest season and Gillian Anderson and everything, but my sort of indulgence in sort of colonial imperialist miscellany is my subscription to the London Review of Books. And so like that's the thing, like, and I actually have to, with regards to reading exactly like that and things like nuance and et cetera, you have to actually like budget out the time to read, like taking in information, taking in story in these sort of interstitial spaces throughout the day, it doesn't lend itself to the type of messaging that exactly you were talking about before, where it's like, oh, look at the the nuance of this, look at the numbers on this, we have the data, if you just sort of go through these spreadsheets here, and if you look at Appendix A, you'll see how, et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder too if if there can be a sort of disaggregation of storytelling as an act, right? So storytelling and granted, even if we assume that all storytelling is politicized, you have storytelling in a political context, in an explicitly political context where it's with regards to selling a particular policy, right? But then you have storytelling within a more, I guess, nakedly entertainment context, like some of what we're doing. At the same time, though, and this is to jump to another topic that I remembered I wanted to talk about almost mid digression. You were speaking a bit about the sort of the interesting, almost Venn diagram space that you currently live in, with regards to your identity. And I was wondering, especially with this idea of peeling back some of the more sort of romantic layers of myth that might be surrounding China, uh, what what was it like sort of excavating national traumas, particularly when researching for this thing entails, talking to family members for whom like some of these traumas might have been literally the most traumatic thing that they've sort of gone through?
Yeah. Okay, before I answer that, I want to bookmark and bracket a question that popped into my head during the asking of your question.
I love this. I miss this so much.
Okay, so we've both been in academia for a really long time, have written a lot of academic papers, and I think in our fiction we try to advance arguments and to kind of do the sort of argument work that we would do in a paper. But the problem with fiction, right, is that you don't really have time to respond to objections. You can't be like, okay, now let me like discuss like all of my interlocutors and the ways that this plot could have gone, which makes it hard to ever be really satisfied with any one piece of fiction, because you can only advance like a very linear narrative if you want it to have any entertainment value. Because if you start like considering all the different sides and being like, no, intellectual humility, I actually don't know anything at all, we need further research, like here are more questions that we haven't considered, right? Like the reader's going to put the book back and pick something else off the bookshelf. So I wonder like how you struggle with that when you're like ethically, I don't know if this story like works, but it like we have to publish some version of this, but a lot of viewpoints aren't being considered because, like I know there are a lot of critiques you could make of my books, and I'm aware of those critiques. And if I were writing an academic paper, I'd probably respond to them or be like, no, they're valid. Like this is a different way you could tell the story, but you can't tell a story 100 different times. So that's all something I want to address, which is like the difference between academic and fiction writing and how advancing an argument is different in both. But on the subject of writing trauma and excavating trauma, so it's interesting because for me, making it a fiction project, making it a speculative project especially, was a way of shielding myself and my family and a way to get some distance from it. If we could say like, oh, this happened in this made up fantasy world with these made up characters that we don't actually like have any relation to. And the way I came to the idea of even writing a fantasy novel was I was in China on a gap year when I started writing the Poppy War, and it was during that time that I was talking to my grandparents a lot more for the first time, because we immigrated when I was really young, and we basically like my parents would talk to them, but I didn't really have Chinese, so like I'd like say like ni hao on the phone and then like walk away, and they were telling me all these stories that I had no idea had happened to them. And I thought it was really important to make a chronicle of this and preserve it somehow and turn it into something creative that other people could read and understand and know about what they had experienced. So initially I thought, oh, I'll do like a family autobiography, like something like Jung Chang's Wild Swans. But then it quickly became apparent that I, as like a sophomore in college, did not have the skills to do that kind of historical project. But more importantly, that doing that project would have required hours and hours of interviews, of forcing them to recount things that they clearly didn't enjoy talking about, that they clearly like to change the subject of every time I brought it up. And I couldn't put them through all of that. So making it a fantasy novel was my way of like filling in the blanks through my own imagination, right? Like radical empathy or whatever, like trying to understand what they'd gone through without forcing them to recount it. But then that leads to new ethical problems, which is like where's the fidelity in that, right? Like if you're not sticking to the historical record, then what are you doing other than just using a kernel of truth for entertainment value and profiting off of it? And I struggle a lot with the fact that the reason why I'm able to write these books and profit off of them and win awards and like, do better materially than anybody in my family ever has, is because I'm the generation that didn't have to live through any of it. And I still don't know what to do with that. And I'm curious for your thoughts on how you handle that. Like where I am ethically is it's better that the story is told than not told at all. And I just, I have a responsibility to be as careful as I can while writing it, to do as much historical research as I can, to not come at this from a very like clumsy biased perspective, but to try to advance an argument about how we understand pain, how we understand suffering, or the stereotypes that we construct of each other. But yeah, that doesn't erase the ickiness and weirdness of the fact that like I'm still making a ton of money off of something awful that happened to my grandparents.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly the thing that I was dealing with regards to war girls and rebel sisters in the Biafran War. On top of that, the Nigerian Civil War is just not talked about for, political, but also personal reasons. And, here I am, writing this book, and it's got giant robots, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. From a certain angle, it can be looked at as this sort of act of sacrilege, right? This really horrific thing, that rent this country in two. And here I am sort of turning it into an anime, right? But like the position that I sort of landed on, and this assumes a couple things. One of the things that it assumes is that I'm not going to be the last one in my position. So, my being able to tell the story that I'm telling and you're being able to tell the story that you're telling opens the door with regards to at least a lot of the capitalistic impulses of the publishing industry for more people like us to tell other stories that may or may not be related to the story that we're telling, right? So, the Biafran War, there's so many different perspectives, and my hope is that my telling of this thing can open the door for somebody else's telling of this thing. I don't know if there's a direct connection between Half of a Yellow Sun and War Girls, at least in terms of the public perception of civil war in Nigeria through fiction. But like, I can't completely discount the existence of that book, which I think came out in like 2007, as having at least, propped a door open a little bit for the existence of war girls and rebel sisters. So like, that's, I think, but it does feel icky. And like also too, because like this was my mom, like my mom was a kid during this. And it was interesting too, because it was one of those things where she had mentioned this story in this sort of offhand manner. It was around Christmas time one year, like years and years and years ago. We were coming from having visited family friends. And I forget what exactly we were talking about. And all of us were in the car. And she mentioned how I think UNICEF is the only charity that she'll donate to, because when her school was bombed and then rebuilt, all the chairs said UNICEF on the back. And this story came out of nowhere. Like we were talking about something completely unrelated. And then Mom's like, oh yeah, when my school was bombed. And we were like, wait. Hold up. What? And that was the moment when so many of these political science topics that I'd been studying in college sort of came to life for me. All these things that I'd studied in textbooks, in political economy class, like all of a sudden, like here was a living, breathing manifestation of, civil war. And there's an element of preservation involved. Like I want people to be able to talk about this thing, and I want there to be some sort of record, albeit a vast like fictionalization of it. I want there to be some sort of record, in part because it's almost like adding to the literature on a topic. And I say that in, to give it a sort of academic cast too. Like the more papers are written about a topic, the richer the literature becomes about that topic. It almost seems as though the better off we all are for it. And so I feel like there's a similar thing going on in fiction, particularly with regards to the excavation of these catastrophes. I think a lot about particularly the Vietnam War, and how so much of the myth making of the Vietnam War was taken over by the US imperialist like media making apparatus, right? But then you have a novel like The Sympathizer, right? And that like punches such a huge hole in so much of the myth of, at least in the American telling, like what happened in Vietnam. And so I think, and I see a similar thing happening with with the Poppy War trilogy, where there is some of this sort of puncturing of existing myth and existing sort of ideas about a particular polity, and even the sort of historical record of that polity. But I also see this trilogy as, and this isn't me just gassing you up, although it is me gassing you up a little bit, like a foundational text in a sense. Like, I think there are going to be more, if not speculative tomes, then fiction in general, or even nonfiction that's written that's based off of, or that is influenced intensely by the writing that you're doing. So I think, if it, I don't know what that does for your doubts, but know that I think that what you've done here is provide something of a foundational text for folks sort of moving forward. So I hope that makes you feel better.
Well, it does, because the thing about foundational texts is that we treat them as foundational, not because we think that all the arguments are correct, but because they broach the subject for everybody else to be like, no, like Foucault was wrong about this, he was wrong about this, he was wrong about this. So it makes me feel better from like an intellectual humility perspective. Yeah. If like the contribution of the Poppy War is like, we've opened a conversation on how we talk about the Chinese Civil War and the Chinese diaspora, and like, come at me and write your
exactly
counter interpretation. You're only here because I'm here.
Exactly. No, but like, it's like, I think so much about conversations happening like in literature, right? And so this is one of the ways in which the canon, the Western canon, is so destructive, is that it cuts off so many conversations, and it cuts off the perspective, the perception of those conversations. If we only think that Plato and Socrates, etc., are in conversation with like Jonathan Franzen, that whole like lineage, it's a very boring and intellectually and societally poor conversation. But if we look at the ways in which, for instance, the literature of Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright are in conversation with each other, and we look at the ways in which those books are in conversation with like Faulkner, and like the conversation becomes so much richer. And I think I love thinking about particularly speculative fiction works, because the canon relative to other genres and whatnot is relatively like, there's a shit ton of like sci-fi and fantasy out there, but like still historically it feels like a relatively small pond, and you can definitely see where influences are. Like, I think a prime example is Lovecraft and The City We Became. Like that, like what's happening there, like The City We Became wouldn't necessarily exist were it not for this horrific homunculus of a man, H.P. Lovecraft, and the stories that he told, and the whole Cthulhu mythos. So I think it's interesting. So on that, I guess the question that I would sort of that sort of wriggling out of that is, do you see the Poppy War trilogy as being in conversation with any sort of existing works of fiction?
So it's in conversation with Ender's Game, which which I talk about a lot, but and I have a hard time grappling with, because Orson Scott Card is who he is, yeah. Right? Yeah. But the reason why the voice of the Poppy War is the way it is, and why it culminates the way it does, is because I was so influenced by Ender's Game when I was a 10-year-old. I thought it's so interesting and cool to me that these 10-year-olds are being sent to battle school and being taught to like hone their worst instincts to fight each other, but in a highly sophisticated, like military way, like and in some important respects they are like decades beyond their age, but in other respects they're still 10. And I think Ender ends the book at like between 15 and 18, and they're just too young to have these responsibilities forced upon them. And so like something that I keep trying to come back to with the Poppy War, like throughout the trilogy, is they're kids and they have no idea how to run a country. They have no idea what they're doing. They're taught to be really good at one thing, but they're so bad at everything else because they don't understand how people work. Like Rin doesn't understand very basic politics. Like you have to be nice to your ally. Like she can't do any of that. Yeah. And so Yeah, that's one text that made its way into my work. And we have 9 minutes left, so I'll say the other part really fast. I on the subject of us being in conversation with each other, I think a big frustration I have with the way that white people read works, but especially sci-fi and fantasy by writers of color, is that it's very flat. It's very like gassing us up for the sake of like appearing woke, where they're like, wow, like I read this diverse book and this diverse book and this diverse book, and they're all like so great. But like sometimes those books are in deep disagreement with each other. Like there are like
Yes.
real fights over like how we ought to represent ourselves and what our history actually is like going on in the literature. And they don't see any of that. They're just like,
Mhm.
wow, like all of these marginalized folks telling their stories, like good for them. So you know what, like if they're not writing the papers, then we'll be writing the papers about those disagreements and getting tenure. So whatever, it's fine. We have to talk about dark academia.
I was just about to say, okay. So what are your thoughts on dark academia, just like as a genre or subgenre? Like, what does that conjure in your mind when you hear dark academia?
So The Secret History is one of my favorite books ever, and I reread it every couple of years. And I think what The Secret History does intentionally, that pretty much all other dark academia books that followed it do unintentionally and clumsily, is it points out the silo that these rich white humanities studying kids are in. The fact that they're so obsessed with ancient Greek, and the fact that they think their professor is like Dionysus means that they don't have to like answer for the murder of a civilian, is indicative of like the kind of environment that universities create on purpose. So people like will make the critique of The Secret History that, oh, it's so white, it's so privileged, like, but that's the point of the story, right? Like that's why it's a tragedy. And I think Donna Tartt was very smart about that. But all the other dark academia books I read that followed just romanticized like the worst parts of The Secret History. Like, look at us in our flowy white shirts and our cigars and our wine parties, and everybody's a little bit incestuous. There's always a pair of twins that like might be doing each other because we have a weird fascination with twins.
Yep.
And it's just like, but there's no deeper commentary going on about like what happens at universities, like how universities are complicit with that sort of environment. And that's yeah, these books are just so white and so self-centered, and it's very frustrating. So I don't think I could read any more in that style. So for me, I think what's missing in dark academia is an examination of what is the dark part about it. And a lot of these novels treat the darkness as some like imposed horror or supernatural from the outside that's threatening the loveliness of the academy. But I think we should talk about like the horrors of the academy itself, and that's not something you make up. Like that's real. Like that's happening in universities across the world now, and no one's writing about that yet. So I think we should.
I think we should too. No, it's I think of dark academia and I think of the Stanford prison experiment, in part because it's exactly what you're talking about with regards to created environments and power dynamics. Like one thing that I saw sort of really vividly at Yale was white boys growing into whiteness as a superpower and like learning. It was almost like they were you could see them testing the boundaries in various ways and realizing, oh, like if I move this way I can fly, and if I move this way I can run really fast, and ooh, this is how I like can start fire, and ooh, this is how I can water bend, but like with white privilege. So it was like, oh, this is how I can get away with this crime, and this is how I can get away with doing this drug, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was because it was all happening in this closed environment. It was, and of course, there would occasionally be instances where the outside world would intervene, or an element of the inner environment would sort of wander out of the bubble, and tragedy would ensue. But it almost seemed as though in many ways, it seems like academia is a social laboratory. And I think that's something that dark academia as a sort of genre or subgenre has the potential to explore. And so, at least as far as we're concerned, we do not lack for source material. So
Yeah.
I will say that.
Oh my
So
God, watching white boys become white
oh,
men is so.
it's
I mean,
horrific. It's horrifying.
at Oxford, right? Like, so we wonder how UK politics got as messed up as it is. Like, and then we wonder, like, how could someone like Bojo be as bad as he is? But if you just like spend a night like out at the pub at Oxford and you see these freshers, right, like imitating who they think they're supposed to be, like wearing their suits, like feeling very posh and talking over people, like, you know, elbowing people out of the way, like treating girls however they want to, because that's cool. And like, I especially think of those cringy ass photos of these boys like standing on the steps, and it's like it's the Bullingdon Club, and they're all like, and it's
Yeah.
like, do you think you're cool? Do you think you're
Yeah.
cool?
Yes, no, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. No, yeah.
It's this posturing, right? This demand of like, oh, I am self-important, and the way I become important is to act the way that these other important boys act, and like when I graduate into the real world, the world is going to treat me like I'm royalty too. And like, it's really terrifying to watch.
Yeah.
And I'm
No,
not just
it's
bitter because once I stood up and when I came back, there was a boy with a suit in my seat, and I said, "Move, that's my seat." And he's like, "No."
no, no, it's not. That's, I mean, that like that's it. That's it right there. Like you look at how many of the architects of Brexit forever were Etonians, and like that's it. That's the tweet. That's the tweet. Is Eton gave us Brexit. So we have about 4 minutes, but I there are a couple questions, and I'll ask one of them. This is from Lola Adams. What motivates you to keep writing? What do you love most about the fantasy genre? So, what we haven't already covered.
Well, I'm gonna turn that answer into a question for you. So for me, fantasy, well, I don't know if I'm really wedded to fantasy anymore. I think I want to switch genres after this next project, but writing fiction is a way of processing everything that I read in the course of academic research, because those arguments are so abstract, right? Like the way that Winter writes, for example, it's hard to make sense of. So when I'm learning about complicated, entanglements of power during the Chinese Civil War, for example, and thinking about how people could be collaborationists, or like how like local violence like crops up, like the way for me to understand that is to write a scene about it and create characters who are living through that. So it's just like a necessary like side project to the main project of academic research, and I wonder if that's your relationship to your fiction as well.
Yeah, in many ways, like there was a period in college when I was writing a ton of thrillers, and the reason I was writing crime thrillers was because I was taking all these political economy classes. And so I was, we'd be studying things like sovereign debt and reputational currency. And in an academic paper, it's the most boring thing in the world. But if you think of reputational currency in the context of like heroin smuggling cartels, all of a sudden, like things start to make a lot more sense. If you think of sovereign debt, you cast that in terms of sort of international criminal, apparatuses like that, then it starts to make a lot more sense. You talk about migration flows, or are you talking about migration flows, or are you talking about the refugee crisis, right? Like, for me, it was a way of doing exactly what you were describing, which is sort of dramatizing these almost antiseptic academic concepts. I think more largely, it's also a way for me to just process the world. Like I think of my writing, particularly my writing fiction, not as like coming to conclusions about things, but it's my way of writing through questions that concern me.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I'm the
yeah,
same.
exactly. And like there's no answer waiting for us at the end, but there is this sort of there is this illumination that can happen during the course of the asking of the question. And I feel like that's me. I'm just asking questions for for like hundreds of pages is really just like what that, and the questions happen to have, flesh and blood and bone and occasionally superpowers.
No, I'm exactly the same. Like writing fiction is a way of untangling and understanding and sorting through issues, but like I don't offer any conclusions at the end, and I guess that's why all the reviews are so polarizing. But whatever, won't complain. Sold out bookshop. It's cool.
Ooh, there you go.
I
That's
think
what I'm
that's a
talking about.
stocking supply issue more than a we did really well issue. But it's always better to sell out than to not sell
Exactly.
enough.
Exactly. Is it, six of one, half a dozen of the other, right? Like that's how I see it. So it looks like we might actually be out of time. I could do this for literally at least another 2 hours.
Me too.
Rebecca Kuang, you wrote a ridiculously gangster book with The Burning God. Everybody who's here has probably already bought it, but you feel free to buy it again. I know there are people in your life who could definitely use this book. Rebecca Kuang, thank you so much for your time, and to be continued with regards to literally everything we talked about during the course of this talk.
Oh, thanks. And congratulations on Rebel Sisters. And thanks for giving up an hour of your time to celebrate with me. And also thanks to everybody who came out and watched us not answer any questions that were actually asked on a Wednesday evening and lose the train of thought constantly. But we had fun, so we hope you had fun too.
Thank you both, Rebecca and Tochi. However, I do have one last question for both of you. This is one that we ask of all of our authors on PNP Live, and that is, if there's anything you are currently reading, and if so, could you please share that with the audience?
God, I'm reading Charles Dickens.
Ew.
Well, I'm writing a Victorian alternate history and I have to get the voice. And the man is actually really funny. Like he's a really, I don't know if he's intending to be funny, but he's hilarious. So I'm reading Great Expectations and, he doesn't need my blurb, but if you want to go read Great Expectations, I'm sure you can get it at Politics and Prose.
I had to read Bleak House for law school, and he is definite. Like, you can't tell if it's intentional or unintentional, but he is definitely eliciting laughter. For me, I am actually gearing up to read Uzumaki by Junji Ito. So it's a graphic novel that's about this coastal town in Japan that gets haunted by spirals. And it's like, from the few pages and panels that I've seen so far, it's horrific, and there's an anime adaptation on the way. And it's actually a sort of palate cleanser for me, because I'm tired of reading about, at least for the moment, tired of reading about racial strife in the United States. And so this is how I'm going to lower my blood pressure, by reading about this Japanese coastal town haunted by spirals.
I can't believe we didn't bracket time to talk about manga and graphic novels.
Can we do Politics and Prose? Can we do this again? Can we do a part 2?
All we have to do is write and publish another book.
Done. That's the easy part.
It actually is so.
Once again, Rebecca and Tochi, thank you very much for your very insightful discussion. Thank you, everyone who's tuned in to another PNP Live. We hope you all have a good rest of your day and stay safe.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.